Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Q&A webinar that covers testing for asbestos in soil. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you all and thank you for joining us. My name is Ros Westman and I'm the Graphic Design and Marketing Coordinator for ALS Environmental Service Line in the Asia Pacific region. Science is definitely not my core discipline, so you'll be happy to know that Peter Keyte is joining us to answer your questions about testing for asbestos in soil. Peter, can you hear me?
I can. Good afternoon.
Hi, Peter. How's it going?
Very good. Warm day here in Newcastle, so yeah, ready to go.
Okay, excellent. So everyone, let me introduce you to Peter. He graduated from the University of New South Wales in 1986 with a Bachelor of Science majoring in chemistry and biochemistry. After working with Sydney Water, the New South Wales EPA and several other commercial laboratories, Peter came to ALS in October 2007 as the manager of our Newcastle laboratory. It was here that he was first called upon for his technical support in air and asbestos analyses. In April 2017, Peter moved into the position of technical manager for air in Newcastle, which sees him represent ALS as a technical expert in Australia in air quality and occupational hygiene. He also manages the R&D programs, develops new capabilities in air and occupational hygiene testing, and provides technical support for client projects, including air and asbestos analyses. What I would like to add is he is incredibly well respected within ALS, brilliant at what he does, and is generally an all-round good bloke to know. So welcome, Peter. It's great to catch up with you again.
Afternoon and welcome everyone. Thanks for the very generous introduction, Ross.
Fantastic. Well,
we'll get stuck into the questions.
We certainly can. So on your screen now is an overview of the questions that we thought would be good to address in today's webinar. As you know, we gave every attendee the option to put forward a question for Peter to address today as well. We received a magnificent response to this, so thank you to everyone that sent them through. And based on the number of questions that came in, we could probably get Peter to talk for hours. However, as we only have a short amount of time today, we've condensed the questions into the most common themes that came through. The questions you see on screen have come through from our viewers. If you have any other questions, you can type them into the chat screen for me to collate, so if we have time at the end, Peter will be able to answer them. Is everyone able to see their chat screen? If you can, please just type in hello. It will be on the right-hand side of your screen. Now, all attendees have been muted, so you won't be able to use your microphone. If you have a question, then please just ask it through the chat window. I'll be collating all of the additional questions that come in, and if time allows, Pete will answer them at the end. This is also where you'll be able to access the handouts that we have put together for you to download in this webinar. Don't worry if you forget to download them or you can't at the moment. They will be available on our website in a news item dedicated to these handouts. And hello to Brenton, Richard, Michelle and Andrew. Great to see you on board. I'm sure that, Melissa, Jane, Mark, Katie, that's excellent. There's some really good, okay, people can obviously hear me. So that's a really good start. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, okay, Peter, question number 1. While I don't know much about the testing for asbestos, I am aware of the stringent legal obligations that are placed on many industries with regards to asbestos and how it should be handled, as well as the standards that laboratories are legally bound to meet. Can you please explain what the lab is obliged to report from both a legal and accreditation perspective when testing for asbestos in soil?
Okay, firstly, for those who've heard me talk about asbestos before, I'm going to apologise in advance for going over to some of the same issues. This has been a subject of pretty active debate at least since when the NEPM came out in 2013, and our understanding of what's required and what's involved has grown a lot since then. I'll be talking from a lab perspective, but some of the issues that come up due to regulatory questions and some of the differences between guidelines, ALS has had to find a response to, and I'll explain the reasons behind that and why we've done things the way we have. From a NATA perspective, it really boils down to the Australian standard 4964. That's what we are accredited for, and that forms the basis of our method. It is fairly detailed in its procedures and processes for handling soils. That includes requirements for trace analysis. It allows us to identify at least 3 different types of asbestos, with the other 3 being reported as an unknown mineral fibre. We can see that they're a type of asbestos, but we can't definitively identify them by using this Australian standard method. But the 3 main common types we can identify. There's some requirements in there about what we have to report. We have to describe the fibres that we find, and we need to estimate a weight of asbestos. So it's important to note that, if we can just go back to that previous slide, Rose. It's important to note that the method is a qualitative method. It's intended for identification of asbestos, not quantification. Despite that, for some low-level results, you're required to estimate how much is there, and also the method does state that you should report a weight or a dimension of the asbestos that you find. In terms of the regulatory requirements, there's obviously different state requirements, but there's an overriding federal requirement driven by the NEPM. It also requires you to use the Australian standard. And in New South Wales, at least, there's also some requirements that come out of the EPA that drive what the laboratory has to do. So the NEPM requires you to quantify asbestos, which is in contrast to the Australian standard method. It also breaks down the different forms of asbestos into categories, so that's something that's not found in the Australian standard. It reiterates the requirement to do a trace analysis. And in terms of quantification, there's some allowance in there for some assumptions to be made about soil density and how much asbestos there is in ACM and so on. So I'll come back to some of those issues later in this. So to focus on New South Wales EPA requirements, this is important from a lab perspective because the EPA has, focus first on the Australian standard requirements. The Australian standard allows us to report no asbestos detected when the 3 conditions are true. That's when we don't find anything in the trace analysis, and we estimate the weight to be below 0.1 grams per kilogram of any asbestos that we find, and also that whatever we find is only visible under stereomicroscopic conditions. So this requirement is in all 3 of those conditions need to be true before the Australian standard allows you to report no asbestos detected. But what it means is that if you find asbestos at very low levels, which is quite possible in terms of the lab process, then we can still identify that, and it would need to be reported under New South Wales EPA regulations. So if we look at that, Rose, if we can look at the EPA requirements on the next slide. What the EPA has said in New South Wales is in the middle of the slide there in blue, you'll see it's a direct quote from an email from the EPA where they state that regardless of how much there is there, whether it's below that 0.1 grams per kilogram or not, the laboratory must report it. And they've been quite stringent in their requirements in stating that the lab must report this, and actually alluded to the POEOA Act requirement in regard to false and misleading information. So the lab doesn't really get a choice in when to report asbestos, even though the Australian standard says there's a cut-off at 0.1 grams per kilogram. If the lab sees asbestos below that level, the EPA demands that we report it. And because we don't know where or how our results are going to be used, we have to apply that to all samples, regardless of where they come from. So what we decided to do, the way we decided to respond to that, and we discussed this with both EPA and with NATA, was that we would use the words of the Australian standard and say no asbestos found if it's below the reporting limit of 0.1 grams per kilogram. But we add the comment and the asterisk there that asbestos was detected and positively identified at concentrations estimated to be below that. Okay. So, as I said, we need to remember that the lab has to comply with this regardless of where samples come from or why they're being tested.
Thanks, Peter. It seems as though there is some very serious...
Can we have the next slide?
Yeah, it seems as though we have some very serious repercussions that need to be considered when this analysis is made. So I would now like to ask everyone a question. Why do you need to test for asbestos in soils? Now, during this webinar, we will be running 3 very short polls we would like to conduct with all of you today. We would like to know a little bit more about our audience and find out why you need to test for asbestos in soil, what your key driver actually is. You'll see on the screen that there are 4 options. So if you could please let us know whether it's because of environmental assessment and remediation, occupational hygiene and risk assessment, waste management and disposal, or domestic or other reasons. Simply select which option you feel reflects what you're currently at, and we'll get to see the results on the screen. This is always a great way to find out who we have in the audience. We know everyone is keen to get into the questions and answers, so we won't spend long on this. We have some good numbers coming in, so okay, I'll just, okay, and this is basically what we ended up with. So pretty much everyone is primarily focused on that environmental assessment and remediation. So that's, thank you to everyone that joined in on that poll. So now we can move on to the next question. So Peter, I would like to find out what your thoughts are on whether the end customer wants or needs a friable and or bonded classification of asbestos.
Okay. What we see from the samples that we receive in the lab and the people we deal with is there's 3 main areas that our asbestos testing comes from. There's the environmental field, which is where we've been focused primarily for the last few years, and we're based in the environmental division of ALS, so that's reasonable. But we also see work coming from occupational hygienists and people working in asbestos-related work, and also waste disposal, whether that's as a result of waste coming off contaminated sites or from people wanting to dispose of waste. So the different areas have different regulations and so on that impact on how the results are going to be used. And as I've said, the lab doesn't know what that is. Generally speaking, we receive a sample and we test it. We don't necessarily know why it's being tested or how the person who submitted the sample is going to use the results. For environmental work, it's largely driven by the NEPM, which, as I said earlier, is the asbestos testing requirements are based upon the Australian standard, but there are some significant differences between the two, or additions under the NEPM. different applications in different areas, but some of the decision drivers in those guidance documents and legislations come down to the words that are used. So in the environmental field, in the NEPM, it talks about visible asbestos, it talks about bonded asbestos, and there's also HSLs, which require you to quantify how much is there and compare them to those HSLs. So it's a little bit different in the occupational area, where the requirements of how to deal with asbestos in a workplace are driven by whether it's friable or bonded, and also by how much, when you talk about fibro sheet, how many square metres of fibro sheet that it is you're dealing with. So there are different requirements, and the appearance of those words in an analytical report can make a difference to how you respond. The waste regulations also have requirements that tie back to those terms and whether the asbestos is friable or bonded. There's even mention of asbestos-free. The waste must be asbestos-free, which is a term that is problematic in the best situations from a lab perspective or from a scientific perspective. So the words that a lab uses can obviously have a big impact on how the end user must respond when asbestos is detected. Russ, can you have the next slide? All right, so just looking at some of the definitions and different interpretations or meanings that are applied to these terms. Bonded asbestos materials, the NEPM defines it largely in terms of size. It's what material that cannot pass a 7x7 sieve. It also states that it's equivalent to non-friable asbestos. But there's other definitions. The Safe Work Australia defines it as whatever's not friable, so it's an inverse relationship there, if you like. The New South Wales EPA echoes that, and other than friable. And NATA, rather unhelpfully, just talks about any material that contains asbestos as being an ACM. So asbestos-containing material or bonded asbestos-containing material, for that definition, we really need to look at what's friable. And if we look at the definition of friable, on the bottom right there on a slide, the NEPM talks about fibrous asbestos and asbestos fines as being equivalent to friable, where asbestos fines is free fibres, small fibres, basically anything that goes through that 7x7 sieve. And fibrous asbestos is comprises friable asbestos material. So that's a circular relationship, if you like. It's not clear what these definitions, where the boundaries of these definitions are necessarily. But the one definition that seems to be echoed and repeated through a lot of the legislation and guidelines is the one on the bottom right, that friable asbestos is anything that can be crushed by hand to a powder or is already a powder. I have, however, been in forums where people have argued that even that definition isn't adequate and needs additional definition, even though it's found in these regulations across Australia. So what do our customers want or need when it comes to reporting asbestos? And what we found over the last 10 years is that, of course, different customers want different things. Some customers want us to use the terms friable or bonded. They want to know and they want to be told what form the asbestos is in that regard. And then they rely on that to report back to their customers or to make decisions on site about what works to be done. Other customers want to make that decision themselves, and they don't like to see the words friable or bonded on report because they might want to assess risks or impacts on projects and put it in the context of a larger sampling program and a single sample in the context of a larger program. So in that situation, when it comes to applying those regulations or complying with those guidelines, then it's the consultant who assumes that the risk of when it comes to categorization, and they're happy to do that. So the lab, as I mentioned, always analyses or usually analyses the sample blind. We don't know where it comes from, and we don't know how the data is going to be used. So in many situations, we're not in a position to understand the impacts of what our words might mean, and we need to go back to the one of the first questions that we led into is, what are we actually required to do? What do we have to do? What the Australian standard does require us to do is give a factual description of the fibres, and it really is about the context of the whole sample, the fibres in the context of the whole sample, and there's no requirement within the standard to use that terminology. So,
okay, that's great. Thanks, Peter.
if we can.
So question number 3, this focuses on the different markets and customers and their requirements when it comes to reporting, especially with the specific terminology that's out there on this particular subject.
Okay, so the issue, the problem with the jargon is that, as I've mentioned, the different regulators or different markets have different interpretations of the terms, and in many cases a particular sample analysis result may impact on more than one or may require more than one regulation or guideline to be invoked. So we've got all these mixed requirements coming from different fields and different regulators. And an example might be a soil sample on a contaminated site dealt with by a consultant. You've got to look at their occupational hygiene requirements, their safety. They then try to classify that waste and decide whether it can be moved off-site or not. They need to transport it, and ultimately they may need to dispose of it in either as asbestos waste or not. So there's a whole lot of different requirements that can come in on a life cycle of a soil sample or the stockpile that it comes from, and we need to understand that our results may be applied at any stage there. There's also the issue of asbestos-free that I mentioned earlier, the problem with that jargon. From a lab perspective, if you look at not just asbestos analysis, but any analysis, you're only as good as the instruments that you use and the techniques that you use. If you use a more sensitive technique or a more sensitive instrument, then the possibilities in terms of how low you can report a result improve or go lower. And it really is, you can only ever say that you didn't detect it using the instruments and the methods that you applied down to a certain level. So asbestos-free in scientific terms is really a bit meaningless, even though it is there in regulations and guidelines. So it creates difficulties when it comes to interpretation. The NEPM, as I said, has these health screening levels and they put numerical values on things, but it's pretty clear that different regulators have different interpretations of the words, and you can see there that table shows the friable asbestos as FA and AF, where it puts a value of 0.001%. But then it talks later underneath that table that does say that it doesn't include free fibres, which is a term that's found in the NEPM, but not in the Australian standard. So again, there's differences, and these are highlighted in the WHS regulations where they talk about, they combine discussion of friable asbestos with trace levels of asbestos. But if you're analysing a sample, a soil sample by the Australian standard, it's quite possible that you find both trace asbestos during your trace analysis, as well as big chunks of asbestos in the same sample. So trace asbestos by the Australian standard doesn't necessarily equate to the concentration of the asbestos in the soil. It's simply a process within the standard. You know, the confusion or the difficulties with interpretation, I should say, over this aren't going away. This is the current waste regulation update in New South Wales, and you can see there the highlighted use of the terms bonded and friable throughout it, and it drives the decision of how you transport waste in that clause of the regulation. So ALS needed to find a way to had to decide on how to handle this. So if you can have the next slide, Rose.
Yep, question 3, that slide is up now, Peter. Can you see that?
Yeah, got that. Sorry, there's a bit of a lag.
That's all right.
What we decided to do was we decided to limit the use of the terms friable and bonded. And we've done this fairly recently, but we've removed those terms from our certificates of analysis, and we now use the terms that tie directly back to either the Australian standard or to the NEPM definitions. And for fines and fibrous is the sum of asbestos fines and fibrous asbestos, and they are defined, as I went through earlier, in the NEPM, and they're defined fairly objectively by the process that we use to quantify them. So by that I mean if it goes through the sieve, it's a fine, and because everything that goes through the sieve is quantified in that category, it doesn't matter if it's also fibrous, it will still be counted in that fines and fibrous category. Similarly, if it's retained on the sieve, then it's defined as asbestos-containing material, subject to a friability test if you did apply that. We do analyse our samples as received, so we don't necessarily go in and try to crush them up when we're doing the analysis. In fact, we're trying not to crush them up so we don't change the definition and the category into which they fall. So what we've done is we've said, okay, if we just follow the Australian standard in terms of the process as best we can, or as closely as we can, as well as complying with the NEPM, and we separate out our asbestos fibres that we find and the ACM that we find, then weigh it. These are the categories that the asbestos-containing material or the asbestos bundles and fibres would fall into. So you can see down the bottom there, we previously used the term friable asbestos, but we now have replaced that with asbestos fines and fibrous less than 7 millimetres. So it tells you which category it falls in, what size it is, and the weight that we find. And we've got a total sample weight, so we can take that weight and divide it by that, and that gives us our percentage in soil. So these changes took place fairly recently in November, so anyone submitting samples to ALS will now see their results in this format.
That's great, Peter. I never realised just how much was involved with asbestos and the specifics around testing requirements and reporting. I'm so glad that my biggest hazard at work is software updates. They're stressful enough. Okay, so on to question number 4. can you explain what is meant in the Australian Standard 4964 by the requirement for a factual description, for example, form, dimensions and or weight of the asbestos fibres present?
Sure. Okay. What we've got on screen here is straight out of the standard, section 9.1, and it talks about describing the whole sample, and in that section, and the sample history. But in clause C there, you can see that it's about giving it some context. It's about providing sufficient information to ensure that you're interpreting the results correctly. Section 9.4 talks about the factual description, and by example, they say that can include the form, dimensions and weight, but they don't define what form actually means anywhere else in the standard. So there's no actual explicit definition there of what form is. You can see that the description that they're talking about is actually of the fibres. So it's not of the material that the fibres are found in as such necessarily, or whether it's bonded or friable. You need to just give it some context for the sample, but there's no explicit requirement there to use those terms, although there are definitions for them in that standard.
Thanks for that, Peter. Well, we'll go on to our second poll, and this time for our second poll, we want to get your opinion on the use of the words bonded and friable when describing asbestos found in soil. Now, Peter, I'm not even going to pretend I know what this is all about, but as I'm probably the only one in this webinar without a science degree, I'm okay with that. I'm just glad I know it's a question worth asking. So this one is simple. Your options are yes, no, or if requested. So thanks again to all of you that are answering this question for us. It's really useful, particularly from a laboratory's point of view, to know what you, our clients, want. One of our core values is to exceed client expectations, and this is great feedback for us to build on that. So if everybody's finished, I might just close the poll off and we can have a look at the answers on this one. Okay, so we're pretty closely split. 41% on yes, 9% on no, and 50% on if requested. So that's really interesting. All right, well, thank you everyone for that. So only a few questions left. Sorry, did you want to say something?
It is, sure. Yeah, that's an interesting response, and that you can request that we do that assessment when you submit samples. It's not a problem to do it. As I said, it's simply that, as I've said all throughout this talk, is that we don't know how our results are going to be used or whether you want those terms on the report or not. And some clients have quite vocally said they don't want to see those results, those terms. So just remind people, there is more information in the environmentals and the handouts if you want to have a look at that. But if you need that assessment done, then just note that onto it, your certificate of analysis when you're submitting samples.
That's good to know, Peter.
Okay,
so based on the request that they make, that's where they can actually allocate or indicate whether they want or how they want it reported.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so moving on to question 5. Now, this is when we start the questions that have come in from everyone. So one of the viewers has asked what the different methods are and which is most accurate. And they're also hoping to find out if there is any benefit in interlab duplicates.
Yeah, as I sort of alluded to earlier, there really is only one method as such that we need to apply, and that's the Australian Standard method. There is one of the handouts describes the differences between the Australian Standard method and the NEPM quantitation, and really the requirements in the NEPM quantitation are an addition to the Australian standard. There's extra steps that you need to do, some minor differences in the sieves, and the extra weights you need to record and so on. But also the thing, in talking about accuracy, it's the Australian standard is an identification method, so accuracy in terms of numbers is probably not an appropriate term. Obviously, your identification criteria needs to be correct, and you need to correctly identify the asbestos. But the Australian, the NEPM requirements do require you to quantify things. In terms of duplicates, most of the uncertainty in asbestos, due to the fact that it's non-homogeneous, you have pieces that might be unevenly distributed on a site or even within a sample. Most of the uncertainty in whether it's there or not is in the sampling process. The finer the sample is, the more homogeneous the soil is. If it's being crushed or ground to a specific size or sieved to a certain size, then your statistics become a little more reliable in terms of subsampling and getting a representative sample and getting similar results from each subsample. But in terms of field duplicates, I think that the more samples you take, obviously, the more reliable your assessment will be. The NEPM does talk about a weight of evidence approach, and I think that anyone who relies on a limited number of samples is probably taking some risks that perhaps they should reconsider. The accuracy of the quantification, as I said, is based upon the sample size and the sampling process to sieving and preparation, and the size of the sample that's specified in the NEPM, the 500 mil for asbestos fines. You can actually find a correlation between those sample sizes with Australian standards for subsampling. So they are based on a scientific subsampling basis from what I can see. So is there any benefit into lab duplicates? If you're sending to two different labs, it is quite possible, even probable, that you may get a positive from one lab and a negative from another. If they both come back positive and quantified, then your results may differ dramatically because of this non-homogeneous nature of the sample. If you pre-sieve the sample before you send those samples to the different labs, your odds of getting good duplicates are better, but not guaranteed by any stretch. So I think it's always good to confirm results, particularly given some of the uncertainties that I mentioned earlier about limits of reporting and how different labs might deal with that. We have over the years seen differences between the way labs report and when they report asbestos, and for the sake of your own protecting your own liabilities, I think that it's always good to get a second opinion, whether it's positive or negative. So yeah, I think interlab duplicates are warranted, but the interpretation needs to be done understanding the limitations of the method and the sampling process.
Okay, so we'll move on to question number 6 then, Peter. Now for question number 6, in what situations should you be screening soil through a sieve compared to just bagging a sample?
Okay, I'm going to answer this in two parts because I'm assuming that the sieving that's being referred to firstly would be the field sieving that's referred to in the NEPM. So the 7mm sieve that you can see there, Schedule B1, talks about when you're assessing ACM and talking about field sieving there. And in Schedule B2, it talks about manually screening through a 7mm sieve and the material retained being examined for bonded ACM. So in both those cases, it's clear that the 7mm sieve is designed to separate out the ACM, the bonded material, the larger pieces. And as I just mentioned about the subsampling process, if you're sampling, the Australian standards for subsampling talk about the size of the particle determining the size of the sample needed to get a representative sample. So the bigger the chunks you're looking for, the bigger the sample is that you need to begin with. If you're looking for individual fibres under a high power microscope, then a finely sieved sample should be expected to be reasonably representative. But if you're looking for chunks of ACM that might be 10 centimetres or so in diameter, you need a much larger sample. And you're talking kilos to hundreds of kilos for large pieces like that. So you can see there in the picture on the right, your sieving process can be quite big. It's I wouldn't recommend that sort of approach if you're looking for asbestos, or at least wetting it down a lot if you're going to use those big machines. But I have seen that applied on sites, that approach applied on sites for the separation of asbestos materials. So yeah, the short answer, when should you screen through a sieve on site, is when you're looking for ACM. Regardless of what you do on site, the lab will still use both a 7mm sieve and a 2mm sieve when we're doing a NEPM quantitation in the laboratory. And that's in line with the Australian standard requirement, where the process in the Australian standard actually uses a 10mm sieve and a 2mm sieve, and everything that's on the 10mm sieve, the whole sample has to be passed through the 10mm sieve, and everything that's on the 10mm sieve is examined. But as Rule 78, if you're examining everything that is greater than 10mm, then if you use a 7mm sieve, you'll still satisfy that requirement, because everything that's on a 7mm sieve is, of course, bigger than 7mm, so therefore it'll capture all the greater than 10. So we're still complying with the principle of the Australian standard when we're using that 7mm sieve, and the 2mm sieve allows us to get down to a smaller subsample once we've created that more homogeneous sieved material. In terms of asbestos fines and sieving in the field, the section in B2, page 77, doesn't actually say that asbestos fines subsample, or the 500ml sample that you submit to the lab, it doesn't say that you have to field sieve it. So you can just take a 500ml sample and submit that to the lab. The difficulty that arises there is that the interpretation of any ACM that you find there will be easier if you have already field sieved it. If you've taken the ACM out before you submit that 500ml sample and you treat that as a separate issue, then your interpretation is going to be easier for whoever reviews the results, because the ACM needs to be interpreted in the context of a much larger sample.
Okay, so
we can just move on to...
Yep, okay, so we're on to our last poll. Now, for this particular one, what we're interested in is finding out if you would typically request quantitative or presence-absence testing. Your choices are pretty obvious on screen, so if you can just let us know which of these that you would choose. We're getting some really good feedback on this. Actually, the interesting thing that I found out about this from you, Peter, is that these options are available depending on which of the tests our clients request from us. That's the case, isn't it? Or did I have
Yeah,
a bald
we do.
moment?
It is.
Okay.
No, not at all. we can test for either. I think the key points are, if you ask for a quantitative analysis, it will always have a presence absence with it. We'll always do both because you can't quantify it unless you've identified it. But the other option is that if there's no asbestos there, if you're fairly sure you've got a fairly clean site and you want to take 100 samples and just do a presence absence, which is a cheaper option, then you might say, well, I want to just presence absence, but if we do find it, then we have to apply the NEPM criteria, so you better find out how much. Then we have codes that you can use on your chain of custody that will allow us to know that and to carry that testing through. It is important that we know that in advance because, as I mentioned earlier, we use a different sieve if we're doing a quantification. If we're doing a NEPM quant, we'll use a 7 mil sieve. If we're doing just a presence absence, then we'll follow the Australian standard precisely and use a 10 millimetre sieve.
Yeah, that's great,
So
Peter. It
the options are there.
Yeah, it seems that 57% of people chose a third option. So that's both the presence absence and the quantitation. So that's really good feedback there.
Okay.
Okay, so moving right along, there's not too much more to go now. So these were just a few of the additional questions. Firstly, from a legal and commercial reliance of data when the WA DOH 2009 process is outside the AS 4964 NADA standards.
Okay, I explained a little bit about how there are differences, and also how the lab needs to try as best we can to comply with what are sometimes apparently conflicting or additional requirements from different standards. I guess the key point is whatever we do, we try and be open and honest. Our core principles of the company, we give you all the information we can. We do the best we can to comply with those standards. And if you've ever got any questions or you ever have any difficulty in interpreting the standards, then just ask and we'll do our best to answer them.
Okay, great. Well, question number 8 then.
So in terms of reliance on the data,
Sorry, Peter,
okay,
go.
question 8. There is often huge amounts of sample. That's okay. I was just going to say about the reliance on the data. That's always a risk assessment that anyone needs to do. As I said, we're NATA accredited for the identification. The quantitation doesn't fall under ours or anyone else's NATA scope. So we just do our best to comply with the standards that, as they're written. In terms of the question 8, huge amount of sample after analysis, it has to go through licensed waste disposal. So it is expensive. It costs us dispose of samples, as well as to ship them around to the labs that do the asbestos testing. So that's an overhead that we try to minimise, obviously, but it's something that we have to cover within the lab. So
Okay.
The last question, sampling density. Because ALS at the moment doesn't generally get involved in the sampling process, this is a bit outside the scope of our services. I have mentioned that you do, the NEPM relies on a weight of evidence, so more samples is better in terms of understanding your site, but that's really a decision that the consultant or whoever's looking at compliance with that standard needs to address themselves. So it's not something that the lab can do whilst we're not doing the actual sampling process or designing those sampling programs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, we've got a few...
so have any more questions come through?
Yeah, look, we do have a few more questions that have come through. Now, if everyone can just bear with me as I go through them. We may have already covered some of these. They've been coming through as we've been going through the topics, Peter. Anthony Plum was just curious. He said, do you sieve the soil through a 7 millimetre sieve? AS494 processes to sieve through 10 mil and then 2 mil. If you don't sieve through a 7 mil, you can't report AF and FA. Now, what's your comment on that one, Peter?
Maybe I've addressed that already, but
Yes, I've got a funny feeling you probably
yeah.
have. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate what I said, in that if the Australian standard requires us to look at everything that's on the 7mm sieve, from the whole sample being sieved, and we will always do that for an EPRM contour or an Australian standard identification. If you look at everything that's on a 10mm sieve, all that will be also found on the 7mm sieve. So if we go straight to the 7mm sieve, we're actually examining more of the sample than the Australian standard requires. We're being more stringent than that standard requires. So
Okay.
I think that's okay in terms of compliance there.
Yep. All right. Another question for you. How does the presence of free fibres when using NEPM affect the reporting? Example, if gravimetric is less than 0.001%.
Yeah. Okay. There's no definition in the NEPM itself of free fibres. I've searched it back to front, and it doesn't actually define free fibres, but the implicit sort of definition that you can read from it, and that we've taken, is that it correlates with respirable fibres, or fibres that you might find in trace analysis. So the trace analysis process, the method for trace analysis that's outlined in the NEPM, requires you to use high power magnification, PLM microscope, and it's actually when you're looking through the microscope and you're looking for those small fibres that wouldn't be visible to the naked eye, that you find asbestos that you then report as a trace result, that trace analysis. So it's not about so much about the quantity that's there, it's about when you find it and in the process of analysis, and it's only when you're using that high power microscope. So we can find little bundles of asbestos and pick them out and weigh them, and they might be less than 0.001% relative to the whole sample. They are bundles that are visible generally without a stereo microscope. They might be 2 or 3 millimeters long and weigh 2 or 3 milligrams. Those are not respirable fibres. They are also not trace as defined by the NEPM, as defined by the Australian standard. So there is a gap between the PLM method, which detects those fibres in trace analysis, and the NEPM quantitation, gravimetric quantitation of 0.001%. So what that boils down to, I guess, is there can be trace asbestos present at levels below 0.01%, but above 0.001%. It is possible that it might not be picked up. And I think there you fall back on the weight of evidence approach and say, well, if we didn't find any fibre bundles or fibrous asbestos fines, or maybe we didn't find any ACM and we didn't see anything in trace, then by all the methods available, we need to make a decision about whether you can say, well, there's no asbestos there. But it is probably important to understand there is that gap. And if you use something like scanning electron microscopy or transmission electron microscopy to look for the fibres, you might find them.
Okay, that's good to know, Peter. Okay, one last question, and then I promise you can go and have a cup of coffee. Should all pages of a laboratory report have a NATA stamp?
Of an endorsed report, I'd have to double check my NATA rules, but I think they probably should. You can have non-NATA results on a NATA report, as long as it's not the only results on that report.
Right.
So you can have a combination of results. So as far as the actual endorsement stamp, I would need to go back and check the NATA rules, but I believe that both NATA and our quality people have checked that many times, and if there's any issue with that on ALS reports, then we'll be quite happy to correct it.
Right, okay. Fantastic. All right, well, we have 4 handouts available for our attendees today. The ALS Lab News 1709, which has descriptions of asbestos analytes. There's also an asbestos method brief that outlines the options ALS clients have when ordering testing for asbestos in soil. And then finally, as part of our environmental newsletters that people can subscribe to, number 76 looks at the assessment of asbestos concentration in soil for HSL comparisons. And number 78 discusses asbestos fines and fibrous asbestos in soils, both under the 2013 NEPM. So all of this and more is available from our website at alsglobal.com. Simply go to My ALS, and from there you can either choose news, downloads, subscriptions, or anything else that you'd like to. So we've gone through the questions. The contacts on the screen. If you've got anything specifically that you would like answered, please don't hesitate to get in contact with someone, either your customer representative or your business development officer. I'm sure they'd be happy to help you out. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Peter for giving up his valuable time to answer all of these questions. We are privileged to have someone with us who has such a great depth of knowledge on this subject, and are incredibly happy to be able to share this with our clients.
Okay, thank you everybody, and I hope that I've added something. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me anytime.
Okay, that's great. So everyone keep an eye on your email, because we will be sending out a survey just to get your feedback on today's session. It's also good if you've got any other ideas or any topics that you'd like answered, please let us know. We'd be happy to look at doing that for next year. So yeah, these Q&A webinars are only for clients like you and not for anyone else. So we kindly ask that you don't share this webinar or the handout beyond your organisation. So for something a little bit more informal and for bigger groups, you can always inquire about our lunch and learns. Thanks for your time today, and we look forward to catching up with you next time. Bye, Peter.